The silence before the storm. The cabin lights were soft, dimmed for the late-night flight. Passengers whispered, some already drifting into sleep while others scrolled through glowing phone screens. In the quiet hum of the engines, one man sat by the window in first class, his face calm, his presence almost invisible to those around him. It was Keanu Reeves. Keanu wasn't traveling with an entourage, no assistants, no cameras, no extra attention. He was alone like he often preferred, dressed in a simple black jacket, worn jeans, and boots that had seen years of use. He looked more like a tired traveler than one of the most recognized actors in the world. The flight attendants had noticed him, of course, but he smiled politely, shook his head when asked if he needed anything special, and went back to gazing out the window. Not everyone, however, was as kind. A few seats away, a well-dressed businessman had been drinking steadily since boarding. His voice grew louder each time he called for another glass. The attendants served him with careful smiles, but Keanu could sense their unease. And then, it happened. The businessman leaned forward, squinting at Keanu as if finally realizing who he was. Wait a minute. You're Keanu Reeves, aren't you? Keanu turned slightly, his expression neutral. Yes, sir. The man chuckled, shaking his head. You're the guy from those movies, John Wick. The Matrix, unbelievable. His tone wasn't admiration, it carried a mocking edge. The kind people use when they want to cut someone down just to feel taller. Passengers nearby began to glance over, curious but cautious. You know, the man continued, slurring slightly, I never understood why people like you get paid so much money. Acting, please. Anyone can stand in front of a camera and pretend. You're just lucky. Just lucky that Hollywood picked you, nothing more. The words floated heavy in the cabin. A couple of passengers shifted uncomfortably. The flight attendant standing nearby looked frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Keanu didn't move. His eyes returned to the window. The silence was louder than any defense he could have spoken. The businessman laughed, mistaking Keanu's calmness for weakness. What's the matter? No comeback? Nothing to say? You've got millions, don't you? And yet here you sit, quiet like a child. Unbelievable. Then came the cruelest jab. If my son wasted his life chasing acting like you, I'd call him a failure. At least I built something real. Companies, jobs, things that matter. The man's words were sharp, meant to wound, but Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, a woman sitting across the aisle leaned forward, her voice firm but calm. Sir, that's enough. Leave him alone. The businessman turned on her, scowling. And who are you, some fan? Don't tell me you actually believe people like him change the world. But before Keanu could respond, before the situation could spiral further, something unexpected happened. An older gentleman in the row behind Keanu placed a hand gently on the businessman's shoulder. His voice carried the weight of experience, steady and commanding. Young man, do you know what respect is? The businessman blinked, surprised. The older gentleman continued, respect is not about money. It is not about power. It is about how you treat people. No matter who they are, no matter what they do. You might build companies, but he has built hope. He has given people something you cannot put a price on. Stories that heal, characters that inspire, moments that remind us of our own strength. The cabin grew silent. Even the flight attendant seemed moved. Keanu finally turned from the window. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried across the rows. Sir, I don't hold anger toward your words. Everyone is fighting battles we don't see. But remember this. Kindness is the only currency that never loses its value. The businessman's smirk faltered. His glass of wine trembled slightly in his hand, and in that quiet moment the lesson began. Not only for him, but for everyone watching. Echoes of silence. The flight eventually settled into a fragile calm, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. Some passengers returned to their books, some to their screens, yet their eyes still wandered toward Keanu every few minutes. He, however, showed no sign of unease. He leaned back into his seat, hands folded gently in his lap, breathing slow, almost meditative. The man who had insulted him shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado fading into a shadow of guilt. For a long while, no one spoke. The hum of the engines filled the silence, and the soft click of seatbelt signs above reminded everyone they were thousands of feet above the earth, sharing a small space where masks often slip away and true character is revealed. A young boy from economy, no more than 10 years old, suddenly walked up the aisle with hesitant steps. He clutched a small notebook to his chest, his eyes wide as he looked at Keanu. The flight attendant tried to guide him back, but Keanu gave a small nod. It was fine. The boy stopped beside him, trembling slightly. "Mr. Reeves, are you really him?" Keanu smiled softly. "Yes, I'm Keanu." The boy held out the notebook, his voice barely above a whisper. Can you sign this? My dad says you're one of the good ones, that you don't act like the others." Keanu took the notebook gently as though it were something sacred. Instead of just signing his name, he paused for a long moment, then wrote a short sentence. When he handed it back, the boy's eyes lit up. "Be kind, because you never know how much someone needs it." The boy clutched the notebook, beaming, then hurried back down the aisle. Several passengers had witnessed the exchange, and the contrast was striking. The cruel words of a man earlier, and the pure joy of a child now. The businessman who had insulted Keanu earlier couldn't ignore it. He looked away, jaw tight, as though ashamed to meet the actor's gaze. But life, as it often does, had more lessons planned for that night. About 2 hours into the flight, turbulence hit. Not the mild kind that simply rattles the trays, but heavy, rolling waves of air that made the plane shudder. Passengers gasped, some clutched their armrests, and one woman began to cry quietly. The businessman who had mocked Keanu earlier grew pale, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Through it all, Keanu remained calm. He turned to the woman who was crying softly across the aisle and spoke in a low, steady voice. "Breathe with me. In, out. You're safe." She followed his rhythm, her panic easing slightly with every breath. Then Keanu looked at the businessman whose head was pressed back against the seat, sweat forming on his brow. "You're going to be all right," Keanu said gently. "Just focus on breathing. This will pass." For the first time, the man didn't respond with arrogance. He simply nodded, his eyes wide, vulnerable in a way he had hidden beneath layers of pride. The turbulence lasted several minutes, long enough for hearts to pound and fears to surface, but eventually, the skies calmed again. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and a shaky laugh rippled through the cabin as passengers realized they had made it through. But for some, the experience had left more than just fear. It had cracked open a truth. The businessman glanced at Keanu, then away, then back again. Finally he spoke, his voice low, almost ashamed. I shouldn't have said those things earlier." Keanu tilted his head slightly, listening. The man swallowed hard. "I was drunk. I thought I was being clever. But the truth is, I'm not happy. I built everything I thought I wanted, but it feels empty. Seeing you here, calm, not needing to prove anything, it reminded me of what I don't have." The confession stunned those who overheard. Keanu didn't rush to answer. He let the silence stretch, giving the man room to breathe. Then he said softly, "It's never too late to change what you chase, but it begins with respect for yourself and for others." The man nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging as though a weight had been lifted, even just a little. For the rest of the flight, he remained quiet, thoughtful. The man who had once filled the cabin with mocking laughter now sat in reflection, his glass of wine untouched. The weight of unseen battle's morning light crept through the small oval windows of the aircraft. As the plane finally descended toward its destination, passengers stretched, gathered their belongings, and shook off the fog of a long night. The air seemed lighter now, though for some, what had happened hours earlier still lingered in their hearts. Keanu sat quietly, waiting until most people had moved before standing. He never rushed, never fought for the front of the line. When he finally stood, he nodded politely to the flight attendants, thanking them with genuine warmth. The businessman who had insulted him earlier lingered near the exit, as though waiting. His face carried exhaustion and something else, an unease that came from a conscience not fully at rest. As Keanu approached, the man cleared his throat. "Look, about last night," he began, his voice stiff. "I meant what I said later." "I was wrong." Keanu paused, his eyes calm. "Thank you for saying that." The man looked as though he wanted to say more, but words failed him. Instead, he gave a short nod and stepped aside. Outside the terminal, cameras flashed. Paparazzi had somehow caught word that Keanu was arriving. Microphones and questions shot toward him. "Keanu, is it true you're working on another John Wick?" "Keanu, can we get a smile?" "Keanu, over here!" But instead of rushing through, he stopped when he noticed the young boy from the flight standing with his father nearby. The boy still clutched the notebook Keanu had signed, his eyes glowing with pride. Keanu crouched down, ignoring the flashing cameras, and asked softly, "Did you read what I wrote?" The boy nodded eagerly. Yes, I told my mom too. She said it was the best advice she's heard in a long time. Keanu smiled. Then keep it close. It's yours now. As he walked away, the boy's father called out, "Thank you, Mr. Reeves, not just for the movies, for how you are." The moment struck those who witnessed it, paparazzi included. Cameras lowered slightly, their usual hunger for headlines dimmed by something more human. Hours later, Keanu found himself seated in a quiet talk show studio, waiting for an interview to begin. The host was Steve Harvey, a man known for humor but also for honesty that often came with tears. Before the cameras rolled, Steve leaned across the desk and said, "Keanu, I don't usually admit this before an interview, but I've been nervous about this one." Keanu raised an eyebrow gently. "Why?" "Because," Steve said, his voice low, "I know your story. Not the Hollywood parts, the real parts, the pain you've been through. And I've always wondered how a man can carry so much loss and still show so much kindness." Keanu's eyes softened. Silence hung between them. A silence that spoke more than words. The producer gave the signal. The cameras turned on. The audience clapped. The show began. Steve started with light questions, laughter filling the space, but soon his voice trembled as he read a letter someone had sent in. It was from a young woman whose brother had taken his own life. In her darkest days, she wrote, she found comfort in Keanu's interviews where he spoke about grief with raw honesty. She said your words saved her, Steve whispered, his eyes moist. She said you made her feel less alone. The audience grew quiet. Keanu lowered his gaze, then spoke softly into the microphone. Loss is a language that no one wants to learn, but life teaches it anyway. When we speak about it honestly, we remind others they are not alone in the silence. That is all I try to do. Steve's tears spilled freely. The cameras caught it all, but in that moment, it wasn't a show, it was two men sharing something raw, something human, and somewhere watching from home. The businessman from the flight sat in his living room staring at the screen. His glass of wine sat untouched on the table. His wife glanced at him, noticing the tears in his eyes. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, his throat tight. I think I've been living wrong." When the past knocks again days later, Keanu walked the quiet streets of Los Angeles. It was evening. The sky painted in strokes of orange and purple. He wore no disguise, no bodyguards at his side, just a man, moving through the city like anyone else. He stopped at a small corner cafe, the kind hidden between larger, louder places. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Regulars glanced up, some recognizing him instantly, others too tired to care. He ordered a simple coffee, black, and found a seat by the window. Outside, life rushed on. Cars honking, people laughing, a street performer strumming a guitar. Yet inside there was a rare stillness. Keanu sipped slowly, savoring the quiet. But peace, as he knew well, was always fragile. A shadow fell across his table. He looked up. It was the businessman from the flight, dressed less formally now. No expensive suit, just a plain shirt and jeans. He looked human, tired eyes, unshaven face, carrying the weight of someone searching for something they couldn't name. "Mr. Reeves," he said awkwardly. Keanu nodded, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Please sit." The man sat down, his hands fidgeting with the coffee cup he'd brought. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Life is full of surprises," Keanu replied gently. For a long moment, the man said nothing. Finally, his voice cracked. "That night on the plane, I was embarrassed. Ashamed, actually. I don't usually drink that much. But what I said to you, it wasn't just the alcohol. It was me. The truth I didn't want to face." Keanu leaned slightly forward. "What truth?" The man swallowed hard. "That I've spent my whole life chasing things that don't matter. Money, status. I thought those would fill the emptiness. But the more I got, the emptier I felt. And when I saw you, calm, quiet, content, I hated it, because it reminded me of everything I wasn't." Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the faint hum of the cafe machine. "I watched your interview," the man added quietly, "with Steve Harvey. When you talked about grief, about loss, I realized I've never faced my own. I buried it under work, under arrogance. But now it's all I see." His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Keanu didn't rush to fill the silence. He let the man's words breathe. Finally, he said, "Pain we bury never disappears. It waits. Sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, but it waits until we're ready or forced to face it." The man's eyes glistened. "How do you live with it? How do you carry so much and still choose kindness? Keanu's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the street performer played a slow, mournful tune. I don't carry it alone, he said softly. I carry it with the memories of those I loved. I honor them by the way I treat others. Kindness doesn't erase the pain, but it gives it purpose. The man lowered his head. For the first time, his shoulders shook. Not from anger, but from something breaking inside him. In that small cafe, hidden from the noise of the world, two men sat, one who had found peace through pain, the other just beginning to uncover his. A week later, the businessman made a choice. He showed up at a community shelter downtown, one of those places where the forgotten gathered, the homeless, the lonely, the lost. He rolled up his sleeves and began serving food. At first, his movements were stiff, awkward, like someone wearing clothes that didn't fit. But as the hours passed, something shifted. He listened to stories, he offered smiles, he handed out meals. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a quiet joy. That night, as he walked out of the shelter, he saw someone leaning against a parked motorcycle. Keanu. The man froze. What are you doing here? Keanu shrugged lightly. I come here sometimes, to remind myself what matters. The man's throat tightened. You knew I'd be here, didn't you? Keanu smiled faintly. Sometimes the world gives us the right doors to walk through. Tonight you chose to open one. The man looked away, blinking hard. I don't deserve this. This chance to change. None of us deserve anything, Keanu said softly. But we all get a choice. Every day. The streetlight above flickered, casting a halo-like glow. In that quiet moment, the businessman realized something profound. This wasn't about Hollywood or fame or power. It was about humanity. And Keanu, the man he had once mocked, had become his mirror, showing him the truth he'd avoided all his life. The ripple of one choice. The days turned into weeks, and the businessman's visits to the shelter became more frequent. At first, it was only once a week, then twice, and before long, almost every evening. He began to know people by name. The old man with trembling hands who loved to tell stories of his youth. The young mother with 2 children who never stopped smiling despite the weight she carried. The veterans who sat quietly in the corner, haunted by memories only they understood. Each story etched itself into his heart, reshaping him piece by piece, but one night, something unexpected happened. He had just finished helping serve food when a teenage boy stumbled in, shivering. His clothes were torn, his eyes filled with fear. The shelter workers rushed to him, but the boy kept repeating one thing. Don't send me back, please don't send me back. The businessman knelt down, speaking gently. You're safe here. No one will send you anywhere you don't want to go. Slowly, the boy began to calm down. And in that moment, the businessman felt something shift inside him. He saw himself, not the wealthy man in expensive suits, but the lost child he once was, scared, desperate for someone to listen. Later, when most people had left, he sat outside the shelter, staring at the streetlights. His mind kept replaying the boy's words, and then once again he heard a familiar voice. You saw yourself in him, didn't you? It was Keanu, sitting on the steps, a paper cup of coffee in hand. He seemed to appear whenever the businessman needed him most, silent, steady, like a compass pointing north. The man nodded slowly. I think I've been running from that boy my whole life. The one who wanted love but got silence instead. The one who learned to replace kindness with ambition. The one I buried under money and pride. Keanu took a sip, then spoke softly. We all have a child inside us waiting. Sometimes they don't need us to build empires. Sometimes they just need us to sit with them and say, I see you. I hear you. You're enough. The man's throat tightened. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for who I've been. Forgiveness, Keanu replied, is not about erasing the past. It's about choosing a different present. In the following days, the businessman began to change not just his actions, but his entire way of living. He closed one of his companies that had been exploiting workers, turning the funds toward creating scholarships for underprivileged youth. He sold off his luxury car collection, donating the proceeds to build shelters. And though some mocked him, calling it a midlife crisis, he no longer cared. For the first time, his nights were not haunted by emptiness. They were filled with purpose. But not everyone understood. At a board meeting one afternoon, several of his business partners confronted him. You're throwing everything away, one snapped. Our profits are down because of these stunts. Do you even know what you're doing? The businessman sat calmly. remembering the lessons Keanu had taught him, not through lectures but through example. He answered softly, "For years I built numbers. Now I want to build lives. If that cost me profit, so be it." The room fell silent. Some shook their heads, others left angrily, but a few stayed, their eyes thoughtful, perhaps questioning their own choices. That evening, he walked out of the tall glass building that had once been his temple, only to find Keanu waiting on the sidewalk, leaning against his motorcycle. "You really are everywhere, aren't you?" the man said with a faint smile. Keanu shrugged lightly. "Sometimes the right people cross paths until the lesson is complete." The man chuckled softly. Then his smile faded. "I'm scared, though. What if I fail? What if I can't keep this up?" Keanu's eyes softened. "Failure is not in trying and falling. Failure is in never trying at all. You've already chosen differently. That is enough." The man exhaled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. And for the first time, he felt not like a man pretending to change, but like a man truly becoming someone new. Storms that test the soul months passed, and the businessman's new path grew clearer. His days no longer revolved around boardrooms and stock prices, but around shelters, schools, and community centers. He felt alive again, as though he had been given a second life. But life has a way of testing even the strongest resolve. One afternoon, as he walked into a community center he had helped fund, he was met with angry voices. Inside, a small group of protesters held signs. "Fraud in disguise, money can't buy forgiveness, you once corrupt, always corrupt." Their words stung. He stopped at the doorway, his heart heavy. A young volunteer approached, whispering, "They think you're doing this for publicity, that you'll take all this back when it stops making headlines." The businessman forced a weak smile, but inside, doubt gnawed at him. Was he fooling himself? Was he just trying to cover his past mistakes with new deeds? As he stood frozen, a calm voice came from behind. "What matters is not what they shout," Keanu said, stepping forward, "but what you choose to keep building." The man turned, his shoulders slumping. "But what if they're right? What if I can never wash away what I was?" Keanu looked at him with steady eyes. "You cannot erase who you were, but you can redefine who you are. The world may doubt you for years, but if you keep walking, keep showing up, your actions will speak louder than any protest." The words anchored him. He took a deep breath and walked inside, ignoring the shouts outside. That evening, he stayed longer than usual, teaching children math, listening to the elderly, sweeping the hall when the volunteers were tired. And though the protests lasted days, his steady presence began to quiet them. People realized he wasn't chasing headlines, he was chasing humanity. One night, after leaving the center, he found Keanu waiting again, sitting on his motorcycle under the dim glow of a streetlight. "You always show up at the right time," the businessman said with a tired laugh. Keanu smiled faintly. "Sometimes life gives us the guide we need when we need it most. By the steps, you're taking those on your own." The man's face grew serious. "Keanu, do you ever get tired of carrying so much pain yet still giving so much love?" Keanu looked up at the night sky. Stars faint through the city haze. His voice was quiet. "Every day. But tiredness is not the end. It is the reminder to rest, to breathe, and then to keep going. Because somewhere, someone still needs kindness. And if we give up, maybe they'll never see it." The words struck deep. Weeks later, the businessman's transformation reached a crossroads. He was invited to speak at a large business conference. Ironically, the same stage where, years earlier, he had boasted about his wealth and mocked dreamers like artists and storytellers. Standing backstage, his palms sweated. He remembered the insults he had hurled at Keanu that night on the flight. He remembered the arrogance, the emptiness. The host announced his name. Applause echoed. He stepped onto the stage, but instead of his usual suit, he wore simple clothes. Instead of slides filled with profit charts, he carried nothing but a small piece of paper. He began slowly, his voice trembling at first. "Years ago, I thought success was money. I thought respect was fear. I thought kindness was weakness. I was wrong." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered. Others listened closely. He continued. "One night on a flight, I insulted a man who deserved nothing but respect. I mocked him because he reminded me of everything I lacked. But that man chose silence over anger, calm over pride, and his choice began to change me." He paused, breathing deeply. "Today I don't stand before you as the man who built companies. I stand as a man still learning to build people. If you leave with anything, let it be this: success without humanity is failure." The hall grew silent. Then slowly applause rose. Not the polite kind, but the kind that builds wave after wave until the entire hall was standing. Backstage, Keanu stood in the shadows, a faint smile on his lips. He didn't need to be seen. He only needed to know the lesson had taken root. When silence becomes a legacy, seasons shifted. Months rolled into years. What began as one quiet moment on a plane had become something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The businessman, no longer defined by arrogance, was now a familiar face in shelters, hospitals, and schools. He had stepped away from the stage of profit and placed himself on the stage of humanity. People who once whispered about his greed now spoke of his generosity. But he knew deep down that none of this would have happened without that night, without Keanu. And so when he heard that Keanu was scheduled to speak at a charity gala downtown, he decided he had to be there, not as a guest of honor, not as a sponsor, but simply as a man wanting to say thank you. The hall was grand, filled with shimmering lights and round tables draped in white. Celebrities mingled with activists, journalists with philanthropists. At the center of it all stood Keanu, not surrounded by security or assistants, but alone, speaking with a group of volunteers as though they were the most important people in the room. The businessman approached, his steps hesitant. When Keanu noticed him, his expression was the same as it had been on the plane years ago. Calm, gentle, steady. "You've come a long way," Keanu said quietly, almost as though he had been expecting him. The man's throat tightened. "I owe it all to you." Keanu shook his head softly. "You owe it to yourself. You chose to listen. You chose to change. I was just there." The businessman blinked back tears. "But why, Keanu? Why didn't you fight back that night? Why didn't you crush me with words like I deserved?" Keanu's eyes softened, carrying both sorrow and wisdom. "Because anger never teaches. Silence sometimes does. And kindness. Kindness always does." Later that evening, Keanu was called onto the stage. The host handed him the microphone, the spotlight falling on him. The audience expected glamour, anecdotes, perhaps jokes. Instead, he began with a story. "Years ago, on a flight, a man insulted me. He mocked me, tried to humiliate me. But what he didn't know was that he was speaking from his own pain. And when we carry pain without healing, it spills onto others." The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. That night, I chose silence, not because I was strong, but because I knew anger would only deepen his wound. And years later, that same man stands here tonight, not as my enemy, but as my friend. Gasps rippled through the hall. The businessman, seated near the front, lowered his head, tears streaming freely. Keanu continued, his voice steady, filled with warmth. "We all have choices, to mock or to listen, to wound or to heal, to remain who we were or to become who we can be. And every choice sends ripples far beyond what we can see." The applause was thunderous. But it wasn't just applause, it was hearts moved, lives stirred. Decisions quietly forming in the minds of those listening. After the gala ended, the businessman walked out into the cool night air. Keanu followed, both men standing under the quiet glow of streetlights. The man finally spoke, his voice raw. "You saved me, Keanu. Not with movies, not with fame, but with silence and kindness. I'll spend the rest of my life passing it forward." Keanu placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Then my silence wasn't wasted. For a long moment, they stood in silence. Not the heavy silence of pain, but the peaceful silence of understanding. The world around them buzzed with cars, voices, and lights. But in that small pocket of time, it was just two men. Their lives forever changed by a single choice thousands of feet in the air years ago. And somewhere deep in that silence, a legacy was written. Not in headlines, not in awards, but in hearts. The gala had ended, but the echoes of Keanu's words lingered in the hall long after the lights dimmed. People spoke in hushed voices as they left, some holding their phones not for pictures but for notes they had scribbled down during his speech. The businessman walked outside, the night air cool against his face. He felt lighter yet heavier at the same time. Lighter because he had finally found the courage to face the truth. Heavier because he knew the responsibility that truth carried. Keanu joined him on the steps, slipping his hands into the pockets of his worn jacket. "You did well," he said softly. The man shook his head. "I just told the truth." "That's more than most do," Keanu replied. They walked together down the quiet street. No paparazzi, no flashing cameras, Just two men under the glow of street lamps, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. Days turned into weeks, and word of the gala spread, not because of the celebrities in attendance, but because of the story Keanu had shared about silence, kindness, and the man who had changed. Journalists tried to uncover the businessman's identity, but he kept his head low. He didn't want fame. He didn't want recognition. He wanted to keep building brick by brick a life that mattered. And he did. He started a program for struggling teens, creating safe spaces where they could speak without judgment. He launched workshops for single parents, offering not just financial aid but listening ears. Slowly, communities began to notice. Not the money he gave, but the time. And every so often, when doubt crept in, Keanu would appear. Sometimes at a shelter, sometimes outside a cafe, sometimes just walking alongside him silently, like a compass, steady, guiding without force. One afternoon, months later, the businessman was invited to a school where his program had been running. Children had prepared a small performance to thank him. They read poems, sang songs, even acted out short skits. At the end, a young girl stepped forward. She held a small piece of paper, trembling as she read aloud. "Kindness is the only currency that never loses its value." The businessman froze. Those were Keanu's words on the plane. His throat tightened as the girl continued. "Someone wrote this once, and it reached my teacher. My teacher told us. Now I keep it in my notebook every day. When I feel sad, I read it. When I feel angry, I read it. When I feel alone, I read it." Tears blurred his vision. He turned, and at the back of the hall, leaning quietly against the doorway, was Keanu. No cameras. No announcement. Just presence. Their eyes met. Keanu gave the faintest nod, and in that single gesture the businessman understood. This was the ripple. One sentence, one choice, one silence, now living inside a new generation. Years passed. The businessman grew older, his hair turning silver, his face lined with the weight of time, but his life was no longer defined by regret. It was defined by what he gave. On his final public appearance, he was asked what moment had changed his life. He smiled softly and said, "A man once chose silence instead of anger. That silence became my teacher. And his kindness became my compass. Everything I've done since began with that." And though he never mentioned the name, the world already knew. Keanu Reeves continued his life much as he always had. Quiet, humble, moving through the world without seeking the spotlight. He kept acting, yes, but more than that. He kept living as proof that kindness and humility are stronger than fame. And somewhere, in the hearts of countless people, his legacy wasn't just movies. It was moments like these, a flight, a silence, a choice, and the ripples of kindness that never stopped spreading.